welcome to Pusey House. Father George Westhaver, our principal, would like to be here to greet you, but instead he's in Sweden and doing good things, doing the Lord's work in Sweden, and the Lord knows it needs some of it. It needs some of it, and so he's gone to do some of the Lord's work in Sweden. He'll be back by Sunday for Mass. If you would like to say hello to him, he would normally play the role that I'm playing right now to welcome you to Pusey House. Pusey House has a library which is open on weekdays, 9 to 5, 9:30 to 5-ish, and you're welcome to use it. And it's one of the few libraries in Oxford that is accessible. Pusey House has about 40 public-facing events per year, like this one, usually in cooperation with partners within the university and without, some international and some local. And Pusey House also has functioned as an informal chaplaincy in the Anglo-Catholic tradition to the university, continuing within the Church of England the traditions of the Oxford movement, with Pusey as our well, I'd say patron saint, but I guess that's not actually what he is, but as our role model. Pusey House has a Center for Theology, Law, and Culture here, which I'm the director of, in which John Ritzma is one of our researchers. There are other researchers who do things here throughout the year. Find out more information on the website, puseyhouse.co.uk/CTLC. And today, we are going to introduce a topic we haven't touched on much before, but a topic that should enjoy more study within the university, and that's the part of the affectual nature of humans, the matters of the heart, which are often seen as unfit for treatment within the university and by minds. Whereas the traditions that preceded us and that we still participate in might have allowed us to think with our hearts, or to feel with our heads, or to combine the affectual and the rational parts of ourselves in all kinds of ways, in joy and also in loss. And the meaning of mourning will be the topic of our talk by the speaker, whom I'll introduce in a moment. Very briefly, before introducing him, this kind of talk is made possible by the Humane Philosophy Society, which our speaker is the founder of and has shepherded with a number of other young academics for the past 12 years, 11 years, decade-ish. And it's works together now with the University of Warsaw, where our speaker is also an associate professor, and the Ian Ramsey Center here in Oxford, which has been a conduit for money from the John Templeton Foundation for the last half a decade, doing projects actually that deal with science and religion, but particularly in Central and Eastern Europe. And so the connection with the University of Warsaw has been honed and enjoyed and nursed during this time. Now, our speaker is research fellow, maybe even senior now, senior research fellow at Blackfriars Hall, University of Oxford, just next door, our friends next door, in addition to his work at the University of Warsaw. And he continues to be busy with what could broadly be understood as philosophy of culture, which is also the department, the sub-faculty that he teaches in the University of Warsaw. That's slightly unknown outside of the continent, so I might let him introduce you to what philosophy of culture is if you don't know yet. But needless to say, the issues that philosophy of culture deals with could include things like a philosophy of, or ideas about, mourning. I won't say too much more about Mikołaj Sławkowski-Rode, a friend and colleague and someone with whom I shared a mentor. And that mentor's death, I think, was one of the reasons why these thoughts were bubbling up in our minds and in the minds of people around us. And ironically, one of the last things this mentor wrote was an essay that ended up in the book that Mikołaj edited on the meaning of mourning, and that was Sir Roger Scruton's last essay on the work of mourning, which also showed up in First Things magazine. So there is a personal context to all of this, in having actually lost and having to learn to mourn someone in our adult lives who was quite formative to us and whose mark is still on certain parts of this university and certainly parts of this university that are busy with big ideas and with the effectual parts of our hearts and our souls. Very quickly, if you want to hear more about things like this, please sign up on this list, and you'll get a weekly email from us about what's on at Pusey House. We're rich in many things, but not actually money. We don't have lights in the chapel. We literally don't have lights that work in the chapel well. We're looking to install a proper lighting system here, and we're raising money for that. There's a machine there if you'd like to give with a card. And if you'd like to give ready money, we'll pass this around. Without anything further said, I'll introduce Dr. Mikołaj Sławkowski-Rode to speak on the work of mourning.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, for this extremely kind introduction. I hope today's talk is going to be a case study in philosophy of culture. So if you permit me, I won't start by a lecture on what philosophy of culture is, but just jump straight into it. One thing I should say, though, is Jonathan kindly mentioned our mutual mentor, Roger Scruton. I think that if you're familiar with Roger Scruton's work, that is also a species of philosophy of culture. Jonathan has managed to say something about all the organizations that have brought us together this evening. I would like to just additionally thank all of you for coming to hear me speak on something that can only at a stretch be considered an afternoon's entertainment. But I'll do my best. And I should also just say that I'll be talking about not only ideas that I have myself put in a paper that appeared in this volume alongside the other contributions, but I'll be touching on some of the themes that appear in other papers in that volume as well. So if you're interested in finding out more, all of these themes are developed in this book at greater length, and I'll be pointing to those passages or moments that can be read up on as we go along. So Colin Murray Parkes says that grief is the price we pay for love. We sometimes associate this saying or this idea with Queen Elizabeth II, who said this to the 250 British families who were affected by the 9/11 bombings. But she popularized the idea that Colin Murray Parkes formulated in one of his more influential books on the theme of mourning. He's a preeminent psychologist working or who had worked on the theme in the 20th century, also an author of one of the papers in this volume entitled Grieving and Mourning. He draws a distinction between grief and mourning, grief being the psychological condition we find ourselves in when we suffer a loss, and mourning being a form of sometimes ritualistic working through that emotional burden that befalls us when we grieve after someone's passing away, and hopefully one that leads to a conclusion. So grief is the price we pay for love, Colin Murray Parkes tells us, and this is obviously true on one level. True emotional attachment, I think, inevitably entails a vulnerability to be deeply hurt by loss. And if we have no such vulnerability, I think, it is not clear in what sense we might speak of the emotional attachment in the first place. If we're not open to being hurt, what does our attachment consist in? I think that's absolutely right. However, simultaneously, the reference to a price or cost forces us to consider what cost is adequate when we might feel that we're being overcharged, as it were. And this, in turn, I think opens the door to thinking about mourning and grief in terms of cost management. There's another paper on this very theme by Kathy Mason and Matt Dougherty, Mourning and the Recognition of Value, where the authors consider the problem of unending mourning. And that is whether it is possible to simultaneously hold something in our life to be supremely valuable and to move on after experiencing its loss. The question is whether if something is supremely valuable, are we not tied to unending mourning? This is something that I think Kierkegaard thought we should be involved in, and in fact actively so. The last chapter of his very influential book, The Works of Love, is entitled The Work of Love in Mourning One Dead, where Kierkegaard persuades us that if we are not involved or if we're not invested in the task of mourning a loss for the rest of our lives after we have lost someone of this supreme value, perhaps a spouse, perhaps a best friend in the Aristotelian sense, we show ourselves up as incapable of true feeling in the first place and not having valued that relationship properly. He says that, in fact, paradoxically in a way, it is only when we lose someone that our commitment can be truly shown to have been meaningful and deep. We cannot do this while the person is alive because we're constantly in the presence of the reward in the form of the other person's mutual attachment we gain from our relationship. Once that relationship is gone, then we are tested on the ground whether we're able to retain that bond without the gratification that we get from the other's presence in our life. And this is reflected, this attitude, I think, Kierkegaard was very much a man of his time, and this attitude is reflected in traditional mourning practices that we know from the 19th century and previous eras. So, for example, Queen Victoria wore mourning black after death of her beloved Prince Albert for the remaining 40 years of her life. My great-grandmother, Helena, did the same after the death of her first husband, and she didn't stop wearing black even after she had remarried. Now, this practice has fallen out of favor. It's more and more rare to see people wearing mourning black or, revisiting the graves of their deceased family members, or even rarer to see annual remembrance masses takes place. And these practices, in fact, were designed to do exactly that, to preserve a place for the dead among the living, to help mourners carry the weight, as it were, of their grief, but not by getting over the emotional attachment, but by maintaining their relationship and finding a place to maintain that relationship with the deceased in their lives. And, this was true in the case of my great-grandmother, who years after losing her husband, she lost her son, my grandfather, and even though this was a tremendous blow as well, she felt that very deeply that she was confronting this pain together with her husband, who was still present in her life through her continued practice of mourning. And this approach has been displaced by one that focuses more on coming to terms with the so-called reality of loss and liberating the sufferers of grief from the burden that those emotional bonds, now untethered to the living being, might impose on us and hold us back. Another paper in the book, written by Richard Conrad, a Dominican friar and a good friend from my college just next door, considers this shift in our attitudes by looking at the old and new liturgies of the dead in at least the Catholic Church. And he notices that, strikingly, the old liturgy of the dead makes space for something that Richard Conrad calls hopeful protest, where the believer isn't fully reconciled with the loss and happy to embrace it as the desirable outcome in their life, but hoping that there is meaning in what happened, there is a space for them to express grief and doubt in whether they will be able to continue on their own. Well, as the new liturgy of the dead focuses on resurrection solely, and considers it or implies that it might be on some level a mistake to be too invested in the loss and to treat it too seriously. And more broadly, not only in the Catholic liturgy of the dead, but in the broad cultural context, at least in the West, we are encouraged to step out from the shadow that loss casts over our lives and return to happiness. Something that might, consist in selling our parents' house, to pay for our child's education, for example, donate their belongings to charity, or, finally go on that vacation that perhaps their illness prevented us from taking. And we often hear the phrase that our loved one wouldn't want us to be unhappy. And we sometimes say this to console a grieving person, to get the idea across that we're doing something that perhaps the lost person wouldn't want us to do. And this attitude, I think, in turn, is represented or even started by Sigmund Freud. So Freud's innovation in the approach to mourning was to view mourning as a matter of individual psychological health, as opposed to a final stage in the relationship we have with someone. There's a very famous essay that Freud wrote on this in 1917, Mourning and Melancholia, in which he argued that the inability to overcome loss and finally lay its object to rest, as it were, was pathological. And he considered a continued attachment to the dead. He produced a lot of technical psychological vocabulary to explain this. But he thought that our continued attachment to the deceased, as for example expressed in the traditional mourning practices, might be potentially harmful because it is a form of delusion that prevents us from accepting and engaging with the real world. Instead, we start living in a world of fantasy. And the appeal of that approach, I think, is understandable. By making the goal of mourning the psychological well-being of the bereaved, he seemingly gives us control of the costs of our relationships, and which also underlies the autonomy over our own lives. We are suddenly, thanks to the tools that Freud provides us, in control of the burden that losing someone might impose on us. Freud's ambition, as some of you may know, was to demystify the world of inner human psychology in a similar way as Darwin had done for human biology. He thought that he would become, in the line of Newton, Copernicus, and Darwin, the person who naturalizes human psychology, along with cosmology, physics, and biology. And this played no small part in why he saw the continued attachment and appeal to the dead expressed in the process of mourning as a potentially harmful delusion, as I have mentioned. One way in which we can understand the subsequent development in 20th century psychology, which heavily relied on Freud's approach, is that it precipitated an association between the focus on individual psychology and a rational treatment of the way we cope with loss. And so everything else that is not focused on individual psychology was deemed to be unscientific or falling short of a standard of rational engagement with the problem. And so over the following century, the 20th century, Freud's ideas about mourning helped to foster, I think, an increasingly clinical understanding of grief. The first move in which I think, even though probably a good one, was to separate grief from mourning, to make grief a matter of psychology and mourning a matter only of a cultural expression of that psychological burden. And this has been, in fact, an institutionalized approach, or the approach has been institutionalized in the most important guidelines to psychological and psychiatric practice that we refer to in those fields. So, for example, the 2013 edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders, who all the psychologists and psychiatrists in the room will recognize as a sort of Bible, allows for a clinical diagnosis of depressive spectrum disorder from the very first day of the grieving process. This was not the case before 2013. The manual said that symptoms that resemble depression might be natural in at least the first month of the grieving process, and so the advice was not to treat them as a disorder and not prescribe medication. Of course, this is a contentious issue because we might easily imagine that grief is simultaneous with depression and might interfere with its treatment. But at the same time, I think if it is, then we can distinguish between the two. And the more recent 222 update to the manual includes prolonged grief disorder as a mental disorder and adopts the earlier WHO classification from 2018 of prolonged grief as a clinical disorder akin to post-traumatic stress disorder. So I think, no doubt, if Queen Victoria or my great-grandmother would be around today, they would be deemed a case for urgent treatment. The Freudian approach, however, this whole idea of treating it as something that is only a matter of individual human psychology seems to neglect a crucial factor about our relationships, I think. If these relationships are genuine, they are not primarily driven by the benefits they offer to us, but by our interest and concern in the other person. In life, genuine commitments to others comes before our own happiness. So why isn't it the case after they pass away? If our commitment remains, then again our own benefit shouldn't be front and center. This is something that is easier to resolve starting from the presupposition of religion, because of course with that presupposition we believe that our relationship continues, but we're in some sense just at a distance from the other person that we cannot easily bridge in our everyday life, but that the source of value was not completely lost or is not completely absent from the world. It's just the case that we don't have direct access to that source of value at the moment. And with the whole move of naturalizing psychology, of course, that perspective is no longer available. Nonetheless, the idea that I have put forward, that if our relationships are not only about the benefits that they have for us, but about something that is also about the other person, and the concern comes before, for the other person comes before the concern we have for us, has been reflected in some more recent and very interesting work in psychology, which comes under the term of the continuing bonds movement in clinical psychology, which tries to recognize the uniqueness of the bond that we have had with the person who has passed away, and it resists the reduction to grief to only an individual problem. However, I'm going to give a few examples of how difficult it is for these contributions to move away from something that is predicated for a model of experiencing loss and maintaining a certain sense of the presence of the other person in our lives as something that is not predicated on individual psychological or other benefit. This is, I think, because, again, these thinkers preemptively reject the idea that there might be a real sense in which the other person continues to exist and continues to be a source of value for us independently of us. And what I'll want to propose in the end is that although that's something that it's tempting or would be tempting to easily accept if we want to argue for that conclusion, there is a way to understand our relationship with the other person after their death as something that plays out not merely in some sort of transcendent realm, but also in this world. And I'll try to be clear about what I mean there. So I'll suggest just 3 short case studies here to give you an idea what the psychology of continuing bonds looks like contemporarily, with Michael Colby, Thomas Fuchs, and Matthew Ratcliffe. And I think their ideas are, even though I'm going to be critical of them, I think their ideas are brilliant. And I think all 3 writers have made colossal contributions to our understanding loss and have in many ways worked against this paradigm that I've called a Freudian paradigm. So Michael Colby, to begin with, he published just a couple of years ago a book on grief, a philosophical book on grief. And in that book, he appeals to Christine Korsgaard's, a philosopher of mind, and her notion of practical identity as something that consists in the descriptions under which we value ourselves and which provide us with reasons for action. And Colby argues that loss diminishes that sense of identity as we invest our practical identities in others. And when others die, these practical identities are profoundly impacted. Colby thinks we face a dual challenge, therefore, when we lose someone we are invested in. We must retrospectively take stock of the significance of the relationship before the person we were invested in had died, but we must also look prospectively at how this relationship will fit into our future life. So already you can see a big move away from the idea that first and foremost we have to get over that attachment that's no longer real or realizable. So in a sense, Colby, like Kierkegaard, believes that letting go of our attachment in the face of loss is a kind of moral failure. He puts forward a case for thinking that, in fact, we have a duty not to avoid the pain which is caused by the absence of the deceased person. Indeed, he argues that the duty implies being invested in our grief. The investment would be understood as bearing the pain entailed by grief as a necessary cost of being committed to a good that is the purpose of grief. And now, what is that purpose, according to Colby? He thinks it's a form of self-knowledge. Since our practical identity, Colby argues, is invested in the deceased person and their loss causes a disruption to that identity, grief, and here's a quote from Colby, is a species of sustained emotional attention to one's relationship with the deceased person. Kolbe has, of course, much more to say about this, but I think this gives a very good idea of where he's coming from, and he certainly offers a compelling picture of how the work of mourning might involve the continuation of bonds with the deceased. However, ultimately, I think Kolbe's proposal does not fully exclude the undesirable aspects of the Freudian framework that I just mentioned. It is true that his suggestion is that there might be value in holding on to our attachment to the deceased, which is what Freud overtly denies. However, this seems to be, in my view, a difference in means only, since the more important similarity is that in both cases, the goal of facing grief remains the same, the improvement of the mourner's state as an individual. And Kolbe is quite open in acknowledging this when he describes grief as essentially egocentric and self-focused. And in fact, Kolbe then goes on to say that it is when the self-focus is not being actualized that grief may become a sickness, which jeopardizes the mourner's well-being, something that then may qualify for something like, psychiatric attention or Freudian psychology. My view here is that whatever the previously unacknowledged benefits of mourning may be to the bereaved, these do not exhaust the meaning of mourning. And I think Kolbe is right about what he says about our investment with our practical identities in the other person, and that these become strained or undergo a certain rupture with the loss, and that in fact facing grief is on one level a species of sustained emotional attention to one's relationship, but that doesn't exhaust what the experience means to us as a stage in our relationship to someone else. As Kolbe represents it, there is nothing that is specifically relevant to the person we have lost in the way we grieve, I think. It is essentially our own investment in the deceased, our own capacity to value ourselves and assent to reasons for action, which we aspire to reclaim or reinterpret when working through the loss. And I think that on the contrary, it seems that if we are to address the dead in how we approach the work of mourning or our relationship with them after they're passed away, it is also by acknowledging and understanding how they were invested in us. Not only how we are invested in them, but how they were invested in us. This is something that, again, is represented in current literature on the topic. In a very important paper, and this is the second small case study, Thomas Fuchs argues that the most essential presupposition of grief is the mutual interdependence of selfhood and otherness that we experience in the relationship with someone else. And he describes it as the fact that human beings are fundamentally related and in need of others, and that this consists in, or can be cashed out as, being permeable and open to the other's presence. And this openness or permeability is something that Fuchs describes on the basis of this research done by Arthur and Elaine Aron in cognitive psychology, based on which the Arons develop an account of the psychology of close relationships, wherein we observe what they call the inclusion of the other in the self. On this view, the inclusion of the other in the self consists in an identification of some sort with the other, on the one hand, and something that they call self-expansion on the other hand. So the former, the identification of the other with the self, involves assuming the other's characteristics or ways of relating to the world as one's own. We might think about this in terms, for example, of having certain mannerisms in response to a certain situation that we recognize as being, for example, exhibited by our father or, for example, by our deceased spouse. While the latter, self-expansion, on the Aron view, is comprised of an opening up of potentialities that one would not otherwise have. And we might understand this in terms of being able to experience the world in a way that without experiencing it together with the other person, we would not be able to do. For example, we find cats extremely annoying while our partner can't get away from them. We come to, after a while, to see why it is that cats are so attractive to that person, and find ourselves drawn by that experience of them and become interested in cats ourselves, let's say. So Fuchs argues that the opening, that with these two ideas in mind, that loss which ends a relationship that has these features is experienced both as an absence we feel in how we relate to the world and a contraction of the self. So we both lose something that was included in us from the other person, and we lose something from the world simultaneously. That seems to me to be a very good expression of what the experience of grief feels like. So simultaneously, we remain aware of the foreign elements in our experience of both the world and our subjective selves, and associate with the other person's presence. And by that structure being shaken, Fuchs argues, we experience this irreducible ambiguity in grief, which involves a dynamic between the experience of absence of the person we have lost, but also their continued presence in our experience of the world and how we apprehend both the world and ourselves. And Fuchs proposes that the work of mourning proceeds by an effort to end this oscillation, which is painful and unpleasant, and readjust oneself to the new situation. And therefore, the resolution of grief, in Fuchs's view, requires a fundamental reorganization, both of our identity, that now doesn't contain this element of the other person's presence, and the ways in which we relate to the world, which we cannot now experience in the ways that we previously did, when the person who, like the cat we now are left with in our apartment, is no longer there to feed it, perhaps. However, as Fuchs suggests, grief, or undergoing the process of grief, also offers an opportunity to give a new relation to the deceased. And this is the most interesting part of his thought on this, which overcomes the ambiguity of grief in two complementary ways. And he calls them identification and representation. Identification is finding essentially the other person in us, owning the mannerisms and engaging in them consciously, or seeing how our identity has been influenced by the other person, and rather than trying to isolate ourselves from it, to embrace it. And representation is by associating certain external things with the other's presence. For example, putting a bench in a park where we both like to sit together. Now this, I think, again, is a fantastic approach to the experience of loss and grief that is extreme, changes or improves on the Freudian paradigm. However, I think there are two problems with it. As far as the inclusion of self in the other, which I find an extremely appealing idea to begin with, what Fuchs relies on to justify it is, I think, some shaky interpretation of the cognitive science he appeals to, namely the research done by the Arons. So the claim that one confuses or identifies with the other as oneself, I think, looking at the research that's on offer, or the research that Fuchs refers to, is best understood figuratively and not literally. So I think in the end it's a suggestive metaphorical expression for a set of habitual responses to our environment which we are conditioned by or predicated on a familiarity with the other person and a proclivity to associate with those close to us. So the experiments, for example, included things like being shown pictures of various people and asked who we would donate money to. And it turned out that the people closest to us were those that we were most likely to say that we would donate money to, even if there were, big celebrities in the same set. That seems to me to be an overwhelmingly unsurprising result that doesn't say something extremely new about our psychology and doesn't seem to support such a revolutionary claim as it has sometimes been taken to. Whereas the representation part seems to me merely symbolic. It's not really continuing the relationship with the other person as commemorating it. And this is, again, something that Fuchs himself sees, and he describes the process of mourning that is characterized by identification and representation, as he has it, as the process of losing the person a second time, which is a little strange given that he wants it to be a process that in a way reestablishes our relationship with the other. So it seems that despite appearances, Fuchs's theory does not give us a satisfactory account of what maintaining a relationship with the dead might consist in. Again, as with Kolbe's argument, this approach points to important aspects, I think, of the experience of grief and gives us a compelling picture of what a resolution of grief may involve. Yet the picture seems incomplete. How much time do we have?
We need to be out of this room at 5:20, so it depends how much Q&A.
Tremendous. That's very good news. We're very much on track. So I just want to briefly cover a third case study of, I think, my favorite author on the topic, Matthew Ratcliffe, who invokes very much the same idea that I invoke in how I approach the topic, which is that of second-person relatedness. However, we differ slightly in how we understand it, which is the final point that I'm going to cover. So the other person, Matthew Ratcliffe argues, is not just experience as present within the world where we encounter them, but they also constitute an intelligibility condition for that world. It's a bit of a Kantian thought. We might look at it in the sense of a transcendental argument, but experiencing the world in a certain way requires the condition of the other person being there for us. And thus the death of a person we are related to in this way, where they provide an intelligibility condition for the world, entails not only the loss of an object in the world, not only something becoming missing from our own phenomenology, but the ability to relate to the world as such, or a certain way we can relate to the world. And this may include the ability to relate to ourselves as the social and psychological representation of ourselves that we have is part of the world. And this is something that I think C.S. Lewis very evocatively expresses in the famous accounts of the experience of loss that he had after the death of Joy Davidman, his wife, and recorded in the book A Grief Observed, originally published under a pseudonym. And he describes grief as having a non-local and a local aspect, which I think both of these refer very well to this idea that Radcliffe is talking about. The first of these is more pervasive and all-embracing, C.S. Lewis thinks, and he compares it to an invisible blanket separating him from the world. Then, in a very famous passage that I'm sure most of you know, he expands on this with the statement, and this is a quote from Lewis, "The act of living is different all through. Her absence is like the sky spread over everything." Over the other aspect, he says, "There is no one place where her absence comes locally home to me, and it is a place I can't avoid. I mean my own body. It had such a different importance while it was the body of H's lover. Now it's like an empty house." And I think most revealingly, Lewis adds to this, "But don't let me deceive myself. This body would become important to me again, and pretty quickly, if I thought there was anything wrong with it." Now, I think this passage is very often misinterpreted as meaning that C.S. Lewis thinks that that aspect of grief would go away once he became important to himself through something wrong. And so grief is something that is not wrong with him, it's something on the outside. So if there's something actually wrong, he can distance himself from his own person. I don't think that's right at all. I think it's as though Lewis is unable to see himself as a subject in the way he was seen by Joy. He sees himself as something completely empty, an empty house, or something that Merleau-Ponty would call, a darkness filled with organs. When something becomes wrong, he understands, he can relate to himself as a mechanism that becomes broken. There's no further fact about it. I think it looked at in this way, it becomes a really scary passage showing the depths of his grief. So the loss of the intelligibility and integrity of the experienced world, on Radcliffe's view, is crucially not merely due to one's own inability to relate to it in the usual ways, but also due to the inability of the other to do so. This aspect of the experience of loss is a form of continued second-person relatedness to the deceased, to the idea of the we as something that is the joint subject of a given experience. It is, as Radcliffe puts it, a kind of participation in the death of the other person that encompasses their inability to continue to participate in experiencing and shaping the shared world of experience, including the bereaved person's place in it. And what Radcliffe is drawing on here is Edith Stein's account on empathy, where Edith Stein proposes the extremely radical idea that when we feel empathy, it is not that we understand the other person's predicament or feel it ourselves. We enter into the other person's phenomenological stance and feel the predicament that they're in as theirs and not ours. It's not that we think, oh, how miserable it would be if we were in those circumstances, and therefore we pity the other person. She wants to make a distinction between empathy and pity along those lines, and she wants to say that empathy is having the experience as the other person and not ourselves. There are various philosophical questions about how exactly that would work, but I think the idea is possible to approach from various angles. If we accept this Radcliffe-Stein idea, grief is not merely something that follows the recognition of loss, but it is partly constitutive of that recognition. Or, in other words, the experience of loss and the ensuing grief can tell us something about the nature of our relationships with others, and importantly, something that is perhaps uniquely discernible in those circumstances. We might say that in grief, we are able to understand the other person in a way that without that experience, we wouldn't be able to. This is a continuation of our relationship with them in an important and deep sense. And this, I think, is certainly in line with Kierkegaard's claim that our response to death, the claim that I mentioned earlier, that our response to death of the other person is the ultimate test of the nature of our relationship with them. If our response is self-centered, where we look for consolation and moving beyond it, then Kierkegaard would harshly say that we were never so invested in that relationship in the beginning. The difficulty, I think, however, seems to be that if we fully appreciate the second-person character of grief, we lose, in a sense, the sight of the purpose of grief, like healing or something. It's just an experience that we undergo and not something that we might find we ought to be invested in. And I think both Fuchs and Kolbe have a very good point in saying that there's a certain duty that we have to the dead in some sense. Well, they both want to say that the duty is ultimately to us, but we might, look at it in a slightly different way. But there is a certain degree of duty involved where it's not only something that we passively undergo, as persuasive as Radcliffe's idea might be, but something that we ought to pursue. And so here is my final thoughts. What would that goal be on Fuchs's account of what the relationship with others we have that he has presented? And that is what I think is lacking from his account. So my suggestion is that thing that might be the goal of grief, rather than making it just an experience that we have and that might continue, is sharing the world in a certain way, sustaining the life of a culture that we all share in the sense of the meanings and values we all assent to when we organize our lives and our lives with others. And this is something that two contributors in this volume talk about in their chapters, and that's Roger Scruton, who I already mentioned, and also Raymond Tallis, who has a final paper beautifully entitled The Difficult Art of Outliving. So I mentioned that this is something that is different from appealing to a transcendent reality where we find that our relationship with someone else might continue, and that this is something, this attitude to loss requires us only to look at the world where this relationship in a way still plays out or still exists. I think that this world of meanings and values is also something that is shaped, or something primarily that is shaped by our relationship with the other person. As individuals, we're only objects in the world, as other objects that float about. However, in relating to others, we become subjects. And the subjective world, or the intersubjective world, is the world of meanings that we ascribe to our actions and obligations and so on. And that world is something, first and foremost, that is shaped by our relationships with others. As soon as an object enters into that world, it gains some meaning. For example, someone finally moves in with us and they bring with them this extremely ugly porcelain egg. But the egg is extremely important to them because it represents the relationship they've had with their grandmother. And knowing that person and seeing how their grandmother influenced how they respond to the world and how that way of responding to the world still lives on in our person, we start to appreciate what looking at an egg in this way might be. So, practically speaking, that kind of stance we have to the person we have lost might mean, rather than selling the house and so on, might mean, adopting the potted plant collection orphaned by our grandmother, or the egg, going on holiday to the place that they would have liked to go, rather than to the place that we missed out on going, or doing something, our father always wanted to do but never did, like, restoring that old clock or something. But making a place for the dead in our lives is not limited to such private gestures, I want to say, and that in a way, more importantly, it also requires that we make place for the community that was once theirs. So this world of meaning and value is never private. It's always something that we live in with others in a sort of expanding circles setup. So in Poland, for instance, there's a traditional mourning practice, Kashubian wake, which is more colloquially called the Hollow Night, in which friends and family gather together on the evening before burial, very often a whole village, and sing together until dawn with coffee and snacks to reaffirm their ties in recognition of the fact that a person disappearing from the community might loosen the ties that the community has, as they were the connecting points between many people. And so the community knows that there's a need to come together and find shortcuts that now are unavailable because they would run through that person's life. But less ritualistically, I think, you might achieve a similar effect by, inviting your deceased friends to dinner, or your deceased parents' friend to dinner, or to join, for a walk in the graveyard with those who feel that they would like to, but not being part of the family, think it might be a bit awkward to do. So all of this might sound innocent enough, and you might think this is pushing out an open door. But the followers of Freud, I want to suggest, see such behavior as suspect and a potential risk for our psychological well-being. So we might, for example, the Freudians might say, find it harder to take advantage of new and potentially fulfilling opportunities as a result of our preoccupation, with the arguably stale remnants of the past or something like that. However, I want to say in response to this, and this is the thought that I floated at the start and with which I'll conclude, that the most significant thing in our lives surely cannot be how good we feel. Surely, it is a burden to perpetually honor those who we have lost or find in ourselves, a way of engaging with the world that prohibits us from, engaging with certain things. But to see our commitments as only in small part constituted by our duties to the living and not dissolved by their death is something that I think is an inassuageable part of living in this shared world of meaning and value. If we don't do that, we all live as atomic individuals with no connections to one another. So I think it is, ultimately more human and a better way to relating to the world as well than viewing other people in effect as a path or alternatively an impediment to our own self-contentment, to be embraced or let go as our sense of well-being requires. I think that strand in thinking about our relationships and how we are to approach grief is something that is at the heart of, as one of the factors of why our societies are becoming more and more atomized. And I think making a greater space for the dead in those societies, and therefore in our personal lives as well, is a way of bringing them back together. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mikołaj. We have about 15 minutes with which we can have questions and discussion with the speaker. And after that point, there'll be a 10-minute pause. And for those of you who would like to join us for evening prayer, which is self-sung evensong, but don't worry, we have many wonderful voices in our choir that can, in our community, that can lead the singing. But we'll have that just there at 5:30. It lasts a little less than a half an hour, and you're more than welcome to join. But the formal programming will be about 15 minutes further. So that said, we're going to start with questions from this part of the audience who obeyed me earlier and came close. So who would like to lead with a question? We'll go here and here. There.
That was a wonderful talk, Mikołaj. Thank you so much. I wonder whether you want to say something about burial practices. And this is an issue because an increasing tendency in this country is to follow a practice which I think goes back to the French Revolution of incinerating bodies. And in the Catholic Church, it's not forbidden, but it is encouraged to bury rather than blasting the body to ash. And certainly having buried both my parents for the last 3 years, I'm very grateful for what you call the ongoing bond. So do you want to say something about how we treat our bodies? Thank you very much. Dead bodies. Sorry.
Thank you very much. That's an excellent question, I think, and it might differ from person to person and from relationship to relationship. But I think the fact that cremation has become so popular is very much in line with the development in psychology and culture more broadly that I suggested started with Freud, and that is for the following reason. It seems more plausible that we feel subjectively that the person who we're trying to liberate ourselves from the burden of having the relationship with and no longer satisfying us be removed from the world if we cremate them rather than if we create a place for them. I think Thomas Fuchs talks about commemoration for that reason. He sees the same thing. He thinks that for more or less selfish reasons, to do again in a way with our psychological well-being and stability, it is better for continuing the bond to have the person present, have the person commemorated in some way. For some people, I think this cremation and scattering ashes in a place of their choice might provide that. And so I don't have a strong view one way or another whether cremation should be penalized or something like that. But I do think that the rising popularity of cremation is not due to the intention to commemorate, but it's rather aligned with the intention to move on and not continue a relationship or the memory of someone in any way. I think it's more plausible than not that this might be the case.
Mikołaj, if I could jump in really quickly there. A friend
Yes.
of mine, a contemporary of mine at university died young, quite a close friend, and he was an only child, and his family... A friend of mine from university, contemporary, died young. He was around 30, and his parents decided to cremate him, and have since had a kind of a semi-public mourning of him on Facebook. And I found, curiously, I think immediate cremation almost denied the death and made him present everywhere for them in a way, and not in any specific place. And that was a curiosity. So it was almost a denial of having to deal with the fact that we do decompose and eventually turn back into nature in a certain way by insisting on the cremation. That's the only example I've seen, but I've saw it very vividly and continue to see it in my own life about this experience of person. And there's a lot of sentimentality attached to it as well. The person becomes kind of ubiquitous,
Yes.
and almost angelic.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. It's harder to imagine the other person being part of the world if, as Andrew said, they've been incinerated into a tiny ball of ash, and there's no obvious resting place. Yes, I agree with that. So if we are holding on to that relationship, if we're trying to retain the commitment, then it may become sort of pervading and all present.
Mikołaj, the lovely, the quite charming example of your great-grandmother who retained the capacity through the wearing of the mourning garments to celebrate and maintain a relationship with her first husband and her son and then move on. I think that sort of inherently speaks to, it supports your argument, and inherently speaks to the seemingly limitless capacity of the human individual to engage in relationships simultaneously and to grow the set of relationships which supports, there's a community value. And that, well, it sounds to me, but tell me if I'm talking rubbish, refutes the sort of Freudian approach, which implies that there's a limited number of relationships you can have. So you have to clear the decks to make space for the next one, kind of thing.
I think that's exactly right. In a longer version of the talk, that's what I would have been focusing on more explicitly. You can read more about it in this book. That's right. But I should add with my great grandmother that having worn mourning black for the second part of her life, she then demanded to be buried in a very bright ball gown to complete the picture. And I think that sort of is another way of saying quietly what you had said, which is that it seems to me an illusion that and a pernicious illusion, that in order to continue with our life and be able to, recommit ourselves to the world, we need to let go of these attachments, these old attachments that we have had, and liberate ourselves from them fully. Now here we're sort of, sailing close to the wind with saying again that mourning has a benefit for us, and that's why it should be pursued rather than just fulfilling the relationship with the other person. But I think healthy mourning also has these benefits. They needn't be denied. It's not all doom and gloom, and I think that without in some form continuing the relationship, for perhaps Kierkegaardian reasons, I think in many cases, or in possibly the most important cases, we might find it harder to re-engage with the world if we have let go. That might, one example of why that might be, there might be others, is we might subconsciously start feeling that, we're unable to commit truly since we have let go so easily. Something like that might be the case. So I think that, apart from the more important goal that I believe mourning has, which is keeping the person we have lost with us in the shared world of meaning and value, there is also that benefit that we might ourselves find it easier to re-engage with that world. Yeah, absolutely.
So do you think our culture fears death? Do you think it tries to repress thoughts of death, of dying? Do you think there is like a constant encouragement toward a culture of constant joy and youth? And do you think we have repressed death? Do you think we forgot to remember death?
Thank you, Jan, for this question. Philip Ariès has an 800-page book about this, which has got the title "The Denial of Death." And so, not to quote the whole book, I think yes. I think that's absolutely true. I think death is being something that is more and more stigmatized in our culture, and one way in which death enters our lives, one of the most important ways that death enters our lives is, of course, the death of those closest to us, and so people find it difficult to maintain their relationship with others who move away when they see mourning and grief. And so it's often very painful and difficult for those who are grief-stricken because they face the alternative, either they abandon the relationship which they think they're continuing with the other person in this way, or they abandon their social life of people who feel this is a bit uncouth in some sense. But that has another dimension which is very popular in the Silicon Valley and represented by the transhumanist movement, for example, of trying to personally escape death indefinitely, and perhaps rescue those that we have lost prematurely before the singularity saves us all from death indefinitely, from their state of not being alive at the moment. And so we're pursuing technologically the idea that death is something so unacceptable that it has to be pushed out of our life at all costs. And that's completely in line with also, not investing yourself in the, as it were, the community of the dead, because that is in itself life-threatening. You might, oh horror, come to accept that you will die one day as well if you do that.
Three persons in the queue. Let's do a speed round and then give you the last word. So we'll go Ashby, and then Father, and then the lady in the back.
Hi, thank you. Can walking in a graveyard actually change the way that somebody feels in light of a tragedy?
My question was simply on the question of ambiguity. Your conversation sort of is around positive relationships, but where relationships are ambiguous or hostile, we might be tempted to get rid of the cat after the person died, and the role of guilt.
Yeah, my question was about kind of addressing tragic history and mass terror. I come from Russia, so that's kind of my immediate example in the country which never really managed to address its past and allow people space for grief. But it seems that grief is so massive that it's almost impossible to address it because it's so terrifying and ubiquitous. So I was wondering if you have any thoughts about historical examples like that.
Thank you very much for these questions. I wish Jonathan hadn't done a speed round, because I would like to reply in more detail to all three. I in fact, to start from the final question, some years ago, that was in fact one of the first ideas I have had in response to that topic, wrote a paper on mourning and totalitarianism, and how the inability to mourn, state-imposed inability to mourn, but also the historical difficulty of relating to a traumatic experience, a culture undermining experience, might, be something that shatters our prospects for this interpersonal world in which we relate to ourselves properly. It's called do I remember the title of the paper? I don't think I do. It was a while back. But it has totalitarianism in the title, and I think that's spot on. There's quite a lot of work on it, on this idea as well.
Roger's essay in the book deals with Germany and its inability to mourn its own past as well.
Yes, yeah. And there's a fantastic book called Knights of Stone about the Russian experience of the impossibility to mourn for two reasons. The denial of this that is state-imposed, but also the fact that the oppressors and the oppressed live together in one society. Yes, so I think that is something that really thwarts cultural development deeply. Mourning can be very hard to undergo, but we have no hope of this shared world if we cannot acknowledge the reality of the past. As I said, we sort of become kind of atomized individuals without a connection to others. I have to probably move on quickly. The question about tragedy, I'm not sure I understood it well. When we're in a graveyard, and how does that relate to a sense of tragedy? Well, Kierkegaard means graveyard, and he was a depressive type, Kierkegaard, and I think that danger is always there. But just because Kierkegaard had this depressive streak in him doesn't mean he didn't hit upon something important that doesn't need to entail depression. And the thought that, if I understand the tragic impulse correctly, the idea that, that there is no possibility of reclaiming what has been lost. If we think about this in literalistic terms, at least, I think the way out of the tragic perspective is to say that reclaiming that joint life doesn't need for it to be reclaimed literalistically, for it to be fully valuable. And the final point about guilt or regret, I think this is something that becomes important in Fuchs's and Ratcliffe's accounts of death, and I'm fully on board with at least most of what they say, in that, that might not be something that necessarily plays into the building of the shared world, but something that might open up unique opportunities of self-understanding and self-development. We wouldn't feel an emotion that reveals to us part of our psychology, like guilt, if we didn't have the opportunity to see the results of our actions as something that is completely irreversible and something that is our fault, nonetheless, even though we can't address it. So I think there is that part in grief, and something that, of course, the work of mourning has to address. So I fully agree. Thank you.
So before we give Mikołaj a hand and make our way either to evening prayer or to our own works of joy and mourning, I wanted to draw your attention to what will be happening here next week, and that is on Wednesday, next Wednesday, the 1st of May. We have the beginning of a colloquium on why middle size matters to science, theology, and metaphysics. And in this space, George Ellis and Robert Koons will be delivering 2 papers on the topic, and then there'll be a conversation with members of our community about these papers. That's 3 o'clock rather than 4 next week, 3 o'clock. It'll be 2 papers, coffee break, and then discussion between the speakers and Q&A, ending at 5:20 with a special choral evensong and mass after that. That being said, thank you so much, Mikołaj, for this wonderful paper and for treating us to an hour-ish of your time and thoughts.
Thank you very much, and thank you for coming.